I've been on this booktube thing for a while. I was never much of a reader growing up, and then when I was 17 years old in 2014, I picked up a Nancy Drew book and it changed my life. Yeah, I know that's a whole story by itself. But soon after I did that, I was like, okay, I need to read more because this reading thing, they kind of have a point, right? So I started to look around on the internet for book reviews, and that's how I stumbled upon booktube. So really, like, I started to watch booktube around the time that I started to read. So booktube has always been a part of my reading life. It's always influenced my reading life. So I started reading around July, August 2014, and then a year later, on June 9th, 2015, I started my booktube channel. I uploaded my very first booktube video, which I will talk about that video specifically in just a bit. But for this video, I wanted to talk about every single book that I've read every year since I've been a reader that has been like my favorite book of that year. So 2014 was the year that I started reading, and that year was the year of Hunger Games, Divergent, John Green. So I was just reading what everybody else on booktube was reading. So I was watching a lot of Ariel Bissett and what's her name again? Katie Tastic, and this one with the bananas and the books. And a book that was really popular at the time was The Diviners by Libba Bray. And this is the first book in a series, which, I claim this to be one of my favorite books of all time, but I've never reread it, and I also never continued on with the series. This is the only book in the series that I read. This is like a really interesting, like, paranormal story that takes place in 1920s New York, and we're following this girl named Evie, who has this special power where she can actually see someone's secrets and past experiences if she were to touch something that belongs to them, that means something to them. We also get the perspective of some other kids in New York who also have some sort of magical power, and we get to learn that they are the diviners, and they are being targeted by this sort of revived evil that has come back into their world. And it was a really spooky book, but it's definitely not like scary horror. And the reason why I love this book so much was really the historical setting, and I think this is what started my appreciation for reading books that in hindsight, historical fiction. I loved this book. I desperately want to reread it. I actually tried to reread it once and I DNF'd it, not because I wasn't enjoying it, but because I just didn't get around to finishing it. So I do want to reread this hopefully sometime next year and continue on with the series, but I just have this intense level of nostalgia attached to this book because of how much it meant to me at the time that I read it, and because of the fact that it represents kind of like my first foray, is that the word I'm looking for? I don't know, into reading. This is a really foundational and fundamental book for me, and I just love it. My favorite book of 2015 was like my favorite book at one point. I reread it once a few years later, and I was like, yeah, this definitely does not hold up, but it holds a special place in my heart because after I read this book, I decided I needed to make a video about it. And on June 9, 2015, my first ever video was a review of Written in the Stars by Aisha Saeed. This book stuck with me for two main reasons, and the first was that it was the first ever story I've ever read that featured Muslim and South Asian characters. Now, obviously, it's not the first story to have done that, but it's the first one I read. So for me, it was just so interesting to see a story where, even though the main character is like Pakistani American and Indo-Caribbean, there were many little cultural nuances and little tidbits here and there that I kind of saw, as well as coming from like a religious background as well, that I kind of saw in this story. And it was just really like the first time seeing aspects of like myself and my background, or something similar to it at least, in a story. It was weird, but in a good way. And it's also a really like engaging story. It's a book about a girl who ends up getting married off against her will by her parents, and the whole story is figuring out how she's going to get out of that marriage situation. And it was so enthralling. Like, it's the kind of book that keeps you on the edge of your seat, and it's actually the first book I've ever read in one sitting. And for me, that was a big deal because I've always been a slow reader. Especially when I first started reading, I was very slow, and I used to take a week, 2, 3 weeks, sometimes months to finish a book, and that's still the case today. So to finish a book in one sitting was just like really cool for me. I actually have a very distinct memory reading this book while the TV was on, but it was on mute, and it was on Disney Channel, and the Cheetah Girls 2 was playing. So I just remember like reading this book and looking up on my screen, and like Raven and Adrian are just like dancing with the the other two girls. I forgot their names.
Player, please.
Keely Williams, right. Sabrina Carpenter. No, that's not it. She's Sabrina. Sabrina something. Yeah, so this book, even though again I don't necessarily think that it holds up per se, it does mean a lot to me because of all of the nostalgia I have attached to it. I can't ever not appreciate this story for that. And then in 2016, I read the best book ever. I read my ultimate favorite book of all time. And even though this was 2016, this was so long ago, this book still manages to be my favorite book of all time. Nothing has rivaled it since. And that is, of course, A Tale for the Time Being by Ruth Ozeki. Now, I don't even know where to begin when I talk about this book. That's why I've never reviewed it, even though I claim it's my favorite book of all time. It's also one of the few books that I've reread, but I do think that I need to read it a third time and do a review so that I could really finally have that moment on my channel where I express what this book means to me. The story is about a woman who's living on the west coast of Canada, and she stumbles across a Hello Kitty lunchbox, and she opens it and finds a diary, specifically the diary of a young Japanese girl who seems to have wanted to end her life, where the diary ends up functioning as this sort of like a long suicide note. So we're reading the story of this woman who's reading the diary, but we're also reading the diary itself, so we're getting two perspectives. I don't have the time to go into exactly what it is about this story that I absolutely love, but I just can say that it means the world to me, and 2016 was a tough year. That was the first year that I really started to experience anxiety, like physically experience it. And this book is a very existential story. It's a book that makes you think about life in a bigger picture sort of way, right? And I think as a 19-year-old, to read a book that explored things in, as I said, a bigger picture sort of way, when I really needed that at that particular point in my life, I think that's really what made this my favorite book of all time. Not just because it's a great story, and it is, but because it came to me at the perfect time. Which is so meta, because this is a story about a book that comes to a woman at a perfect time. Listen, I could get into it. But I'll reserve that for a review. But suffice to say, this was my favorite book of 2016, but it's my favorite book of all time till this very day. My favorite book of 2017 was Homegoing by Yajasi. This is a story that starts in like 1700s Ghana, and we're following two sisters who never met, one of whom ends up being sold to the American slave trade, the other one remains in Ghana, and so we're following their children and their children's children, and we have these two lines of these two families coming out from these two sisters in two different parts of the world and having two completely different stories. And so it's a multi-generational story, and it is the first ever multi-generational story that I've ever read. And I think that's why I love it so much, because it was the first book that really explored a concept, an idea that I personally love. I love multi-generational stories. They are some of my favorite books to read. You will see a few more on this list actually. And this is the book that really kickstarted my appreciation for that kind of story. I come from a really huge family, and I do a lot of tracing, and I try to figure out, like, who my ancestors were, my great-grandparents, my great-great-grandparents, what their stories were as much as possible. Because we wouldn't exist had it not been for these people. Whether you like them or idolize them, or whether you think they were horrible people, the fact of the matter is their histories and their stories are ultimately what led to your stories. And that's why multi-generational stories are so cool, because they show that. They show that in a way that you can't necessarily see in real time. And so reading this book really made me conscious of that. And it always makes me think about that. It always makes me think about, like, who are my distant ancestors that I have no idea who they were and probably never will. It was a fascinating story, and I honestly can't think of another book that really defines 2017 for me other than Homegoing, and it was just brilliant. I need to read Yajasi's other book. My favorite book of 2018 was another young adult novel, and this is a book that I made my personality for some time. It's A Very Large Expanse of Sea by Tahira Mafi. It is her first young adult contemporary novel, and thus far I've only read two of her books, Hawaii contemporary books. Avlios, as it used to be called, is a story about this young girl. It takes place in the early 2000s, right after 9/11, and it's about this girl who is sort of experiencing a really rough time in the aftermath of that event, because she is a Muslim American, she wears hijab, she's of Iranian origin, having to deal with the way that people are treating her, in tandem with her just wanting to live her life. A lot of people didn't like this book. I liked it. I thought that it was a great exploration of Islamophobia and anti-Muslim racism in the context of like a 2002 high school setting. I really enjoyed it. It's probably not the best book ever, I'll admit that, but I think it does a really good job of exploring what it set out to do. 2018 was an interesting year for me because I read a lot of books that I liked, but none of them have stuck with me in any meaningful way. This is just the one that stuck with me the most. So I don't have anything much to say about this book other than I did really, really like it, and I still really do appreciate it. My favorite book of 2019 was another multi-generational story, and that's Pachinko by Min Jin Lee. We start off in Korea with this teenage girl named Sunja and her parents, and she eventually migrates in the early 1900s to Japan. And so then we're following her children, and I think we get glimpses into the lives of her grandchildren as well. And again, I love a multi-generational story. This one is a little bit more focused than Homegoing because we're only following like maybe 4 generations or so. But I found it really interesting because it's the first ever story that I've read, and one of the only stories I believe to exist which explore the experiences of the Korean diaspora in Japan, which is a thing. And I found that to be so interesting and so fascinating about like intra-regional migration in different parts of the world. Because that's a thing, right? Like I live in Trinidad, but there's tons of people from other parts of the Caribbean who live here as well. So those types of experiences are really interesting to think about. Like, you know, you are from this region, but you're not from this specific country that you're living in now. So what is that experience like, and how does it look over time for generations to come? And this book explores that, and I find that to be really interesting. I loved it. This is one of those stories where random scenes and little things that happen in the book just come to me at different times. And that's how you know a book really has impacted you. Like, you think about it randomly. And I really, really love this story. Definitely one that I also have to reread as well. 2020. What a wonderful year. My favorite book of 2020 was A Silent Life by Ryan Shah. This is a book that takes place in Guyana, and it follows an Indo-Guyanese Muslim family. Specifically, it looks at the experiences of our main character, Aliyah, who from a very young age has this ability to see into her grandmother's past. She gets these random visions, and then she's able to see what her grandmother went through and why her grandmother became the silent, non-speaking person that she is today. It's a story that explores intergenerational trauma, really, and how that manifests for Indo-Caribbean women. But it's also an immaculately written story and a really beautiful commentary on Indo-Caribbean culture and history, and what that looks like specifically for women who are struggling to find their voice, essentially, in the melee of this particular history, and how that changes over the course of generations. Again, a multi-generational story. It's a little bit smaller, again, because it's just focusing on the grandmother and the granddaughter. We don't even focus on the generation in between that much, but it does explore the importance of understanding your family history, right? And that means a lot to me, especially also being from an Indo-Caribbean Muslim family, like seeing a lot of my own, well, not really my own, but like seeing a lot of things that I found similar to my background in this book was extremely valuable for me. And yeah, it just ended up being my favorite book of 2020. 2020 was actually a fairly good reading year in terms of what I read, even though it's a horrible year otherwise. I don't know, something about being trapped in the house all day makes you want to read really good books because you need to like escape from all of that shit, and this was a nice escape. 2021 was like a really weird year. It was like pandemic purgatory. Like, we still had lockdowns, but then things were opening back up, and then we had lockdowns again. It was a really weird year. Like, 2020 was a little bit more simple. Just stay in your house and don't go nowhere. 2021 was just like, stay in your house but don't go nowhere. But these things have opened back. And it's like, what's going on? Anyways, my favorite book of 2021, and the only non-fiction book on this list, is The Anthropocene Reviewed by John Green. Now, John Green, I plan on making a video about him soon. He's one of my favorite authors and favorite, like, people on the internet. I just love him and Hank a lot, and I have a lot of nostalgia attached to both of them as well. Growing up on the internet, right, coming of age in the social media era, John and Hank are very important to me. And although I love John's fiction novels, his young adult novels, when I heard he was coming out with a non-fiction essay collection, I was like, yes, this is perfect for him, because he's such a smart and brilliant person. I want to read that in a book. I don't want to just see it in his videos. These essays just comment on random things from, let me just even read the contents so you can know how random they are. Haley's Comet, Diet Dr. Pepper's, Velociraptors, Canada Geese, Teddy Bears, The Internet, Sunsets, Penguins of Madagascar, CNN, Wintry Mix, Plague, Monopoly, The Yips. Yep, I need to reread this book. So yes, he's commenting on all of these random things, but the ultimate purpose of the book is to try to connect how all of these things relate back to humanity and relate back to what it means to be a human. It's the Anthropocene reviewed, right? It's trying to understand the very human-centered world that we live in right now. Isn't that the tagline? Essays on a human-centered planet, right? For example, one of my favorite essays from this book is the essay on velociraptors, and he talks about how, like, in Jurassic Park, they are portrayed in a particular way. They're like big, human size, maybe a little bit bigger, and they're very scaly and reptilian looking, like you would imagine typical dinosaurs to be. But actually, velociraptors looked more like turkeys with teeth than anything else, right? They were small, they were feathered. So I think the essay ended up being like a commentary on how humans perceive things, how we imagine and reimagine our past, and how education and knowledge changes over time and how it prompts us to reimagine things. It's so up my alley, and it's the perfect book for people who, if you want to read something a little intellectually stimulating, but that isn't like hard to read, that isn't like academic, like intellectual stuff, it's great. Just read the book. It's good. 2022, hands down my favorite book of 2022 was Mornings in Janine by Susan Abdul-Hawa. Another multi-generational story, who would have thought? So this is a story about a Palestinian family, and it starts off in Ain Hod, which used to be Palestine but is now in Israel. The first few chapters of the story are essentially about them being displaced by Israeli soldiers and end up having to move to like a refugee camp in Jenin, which is still in the West Bank of Palestine. And while they're in that camp, our main character Amal is born, and we're following Amal's life as she's just trying to like live her life but has to navigate these really unnecessarily difficult circumstances being a young woman who is living under occupation. And it's a story about occupation. It's a story about what has been happening in Palestine over these years, particularly through the lens of this one character. But we're also, getting the stories of her family members, her parents, her own children, her own child, really. She just has one kid. So it ends up being a really beautiful commentary on living your life and just wanting to live your life, but having to navigate circumstances that are beyond your control. And it's just so beautifully done. The thing about this book too is that the writing is absolutely gorgeous. Susan Abdul-Hawa is actually a poet as well, so she has poetry books as well as novels, and you can see that sort of poetic writing come through in her prose. It was just so beautiful to read. She writes about Palestine with such love and such nuance and appreciation. It was a beautiful story. It was so freaking good, and I think everybody should read it. 2023, I mean, the year ain't done yet, so I don't have a favorite book of the year as yet. I do have like the best book that I read for the year so far, but I don't necessarily know that this is going to be my favorite book at the end of it. Probably not. It is The Jumbie Bird by Ismet Khan. It's a classic that takes place right here in Trinidad, and it follows an Indo-Trinidadian Muslim family. So we have an Indo-Guyanese Muslim family here. This one is an Indo-Trinidadian Muslim family. And similar to that book also, it's a story about somebody who is enamored with their grandparent. This time it's a grandson and a grandfather. It's about this man named Kale Khan who's very disgruntled, and he misses his homeland of India, but he also is trying to find meaning and purpose in the new land of Trinidad, of the Caribbean. And his grandson, who was born and raised in Trinidad and is very enamored with his grandfather and trying to sort of like figure him out and understand him. It also has a lot of imagery about the Jumbie Bird, which is an owl, and there is this like local folklore that if you hear like an owl screech at a particular time or during the day or something like that, then that means somebody is going to die. So that's also like an imagery that's sort of like plastered throughout the novel, and that's the thing about this book. It's another beautifully written story. Ismet Khan is able to breathe so much life into the Trinidadian setting, and particularly into the setting of Port of Spain in this one novel. Like, he just did it so wonderfully. I loved it. I think the main thing I liked about this book, other than the exploration of like Indo-Caribbean identity and Indo-Caribbean Muslim identity to some extent, was the writing and the way that he was able to tell the story. Y'all couldn't tell me my hair was looking messy. And there you have it. These are my favorite books. Oh, let's see if we could do this. These are my thumbnail one time. These are my favorite books of each year. I love every single one of these. They mean a lot to me. And it's just so great to have been on booktube for so long. It's been 8 years. Today makes it 8 years. Thank you all so much for being a part of this journey with me. I really do appreciate every single one of you who watch my videos. Editing Sajid here, my phone decided that it would be a good idea to just cut off. You know, like, yeah, I really love filming on this phone.
It's great, it's great.
Anyways, what I was going to say before the video abruptly came to a stop right here was thank you all so much for being a part of this journey with me. I really do appreciate every single one of you. I appreciate your comments, I appreciate your views, I appreciate your engagement on YouTube and on other platforms as well. This has been a huge part of my life, and I don't intend for it to stop, even if I do take breaks or I do fall off the radar for a little bit. Booktube is so important to me, so thank you so much for sticking around. And if you have thoughts on any of the books that I talked about today, I would love to know them in the comments down below. That being said, I hope you all have a lovely day, and until next time, inshallah, keep reading.